Hey class, we're doing weekly drawing number 6. This is Albrecht Durer's Night, Death, and the Devil from 1513. It's an engraving, which is a type of printmaking, which allows the artist to make multiples and they make it on a printing press. It's one of 3 large prints known as his master engravings. The other 2 are Melancholia 1 and St. Jerome in his study. Though not a trilogy in like the strictest sense, the prints are closely related, interrelated, and complement each other, corresponding to 3 kinds of virtue in medieval scholasticism, which are basically theological, intellectual, and moral. So the other 2 are the theological and intellectual ones, and this is the moral one. Called simply The Rider by Durer, the Night, Death, and Devil embodies a state of moral virtue, which you can kind of begin to see in the piece. I'm talking about the general content, but we can see how that's happening because we have this guy in the middle in armor, and he's riding through a difficult, like, wasteland with death and the devil. This is an embodiment or personification of death and the devil. And the knight is seen like a strong force in armor riding past, going through difficulty or kind of past things that are challenging. The artist may have based his description of the Christian knight on an address from Erasmus's Instructions for the Christian Soldier, published in 1504. So the idea comes from maybe some writings that he read. Here's a little quote. In order that you may not be deterred from the path of virtue because it seems rough and dreary, and because you must constantly fight 3 unfair enemies, the flesh, the devil, and the world, this 3rd rule shall be proposed to you. All of those spooks and phantoms which come upon you as if it were in the very gorges of Hades must be deemed for naught. So he's coming up with this idea of pushing past difficulty in the world, and he definitely fully showing that it has an interesting quality to it. And the model is really the model of this figure as a heroic equestrian portrait is very, very common in art. It goes way back to Roman times with Marcus Aurelius, like a conquering emperor on a horse. So it's called an equestrian portrait. They're in sculpture and painting, in this case, printmaking, all different versions of them. Basically, a person on a horse. It's kind of like a power symbol in a lot of instances, or a position of authority. They're seated, they have a horse, they're not just walking around. Durer was familiar with these from Italy, so this would have been something he would have known about. And he is considered to be a master engraver with his technique. So what we see on it is Death is riding also a horse and the devil, and he has like his faithful dog by him. This is like a signature piece down here. Back in the hillside, way up here, you kind of see a city on a hill, like a kingdom or something good that he's going towards. And he's walking through this dark area. Time is being held by death, so there's this idea of like time catching up. And this is the devil. It's an interesting embodiment compared to some that you would see oftentimes like a serpent or other things. So kind of like a goat with a horn, and here is some sort of spear um, in his hand. A little bit unusual in that regard as far as the types of embodiments you see. It's very, very almost busy in a way. You can see that your eye has not really an easy place to rest. Like, it moves around and there's a lot of detail, and he's kind of surrounded by the intensity. Even the horse's hooves are almost to the very bottom of the print, and there's things that are kind of in here like skulls, feeling of like otherworldly things. Even the way that the hooves of this horse interact with this horse, how there's like a feeling. But if you notice in it, this is very purposeful. Durer was a really great artist, had a lot of design. The guy's eyes are fixed on his path, as are the horses. He's not going anywhere. He's staying focused on his pathway. The dog is faithfully going with him. He's moving past all these things despite the compression and busyness and uneasiness of the piece. And so this is an example of using that feeling for a purpose, for a intention, to fill it full of things, to have almost like an all over intensified, it's not all over pattern crystallographic balance, but it's all over intensified maximalist type of sensibility in this piece purposefully to get us to think about the path and then what's higher up, what he's going for. A city on a hill being an idea of going for the kingdom of God or heaven. Those are the type of ideas also being shown here. This is these are common themes throughout art history and design. So we're pulling something that's like a masterwork from 1513 and looking at it, and I think it actually has a lot of relevance in its design today, the way that it's working and the way he's using compression and space and ideas to really communicate what he's trying to communicate. It's a really good example of this. Um, Metaphor, mythology, trying to communicate things. See how these guys are all moving out, the dog too, and everything else is looking at him, trying to lure him away or gather his attention. And you kind of get this strong diagonal through here, which makes it visually interesting too. And adding different types of line work. It's not all just set, but underlying it is a basic kind of grid that gives it stability, but it makes interesting lines. What do I mean by that? Well, here we go. Let's look at this grid. You have a sort of feeling of, despite the lines being interesting and going different directions, there is actually kind of like a grid over the piece. You could say he like designed it on a grid almost. People do this often. Think about their work when they're working, like where are things placed. You can see that nothing else is as high up as the head of the knight, but basically, everything's kind of falling in a gridded like fashion at landmarks on the creatures, like the hooves, the head, the eye. Landmark, important kind of visual landmarks throughout are all falling at like lines on a grid. So it has an evenness to it and an interest to it because it feels solid, but it's dark enough and interesting enough to give you that feeling compression. But we get the steadfast nature of the knight because he's very gridded in the midst of sort of this, and the composition's gridded. But the lines and the line quality and the movement of shapes make it interesting and compressed, and we get all these interesting movements happening, whilst at the same time the knight feeling very sure. And I think that shows really how good design, if you're going to spend time making artwork, you're going to want to spend time on the design phases because you want to actually make it worth your while. If you're going to spend a lot of time painting something, drawing it, etc., like you do for your projects, do something that's worthwhile. Spend time on something that you feel good about the design, that you actually thought through, looked at it, were critical of it. Same with this type of work. You spend a long time on these engravings, making the plate, then printing them. This is a lot of work. So he definitely spent time planning this out and thinking about it. Well, that's how we take it up another notch in our artwork. If you're someone who wants to be an artist for, or a creative person for your job, or even just for fun, but you love it and you want to maybe sell it or whatever that looks like in your future, you you need to think about the fact that if you want people to pay you to do something, um, like design something, design a website. My wife is a web designer or graphic design. I've done stuff like that too. If you want people to pay you for something, then, pay you for your sculpture, pay you for your painting, pay you for your character design. You're going to have to work through the idea a lot. People think just jump to executing, which is fine, but it's actually not fine. It's fine to execute, but jumping to it without some solid design means that you'll just have maybe a good rendering, but not really anything that people want to actually use. Because the thought processes and the way of working through things, that's actually where the real money is to be made, I should say. Um, you can teach a lot of people how to render, and people who are in the big jobs who make quite a bit of money. A lot of what they do is not doing the execution type of work, which it's good to learn that. We need to learn those skills and have them, but they're actually doing more of this type of thing, of the thinking and the figuring things out. And then a lot of places you do both, but sometimes in a lot of areas, like after a certain point, you do the thinking and then maybe some of the execution of like advertising designs or graphic design gets handed off to other people to finish off. So the thinking is very valuable, and the planning and the working through of things, and that's part of what I'm trying to impart to you in this class is that you have these skills, but you have to develop the ideas and the concepts as well as your hand ability. That's why we're drawing regularly, and you're working with different materials like collage, and you'll be working with paint, and you've been working with ink to develop those hand skills too at the same time. But the thinking is important, and we want to spend time with it. And that's the purpose of these lectures and this exercise. Is not just to fill time up, but to really develop our aesthetic eye and ability and see work in new ways. So hope you guys are doing well out there and keeping on going at it and just taking everything one step at a time and learning and growing. So take care of yourselves. I'll talk to you soon.